Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Adi, and today we've got a special guest. We've got the winner of the second women's tour, Elisa. Elisa, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. And so, frequent viewers of the channel remember you from the last time you were here, where you came second place in the first iteration of this tour. But for those who don't remember, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Right. So, hi everyone. My name is Elisa. I have been playing VGC since like 2014 on and off. But my first real event wasn't until 2019. And I top cut one MSS. And when COVID hit, I was like, well, it's not like I have anything better to do. So I started getting kind of more involved with mods and kind of just like playing on like the online circuits. So my first kind of like breakout result was like second place in that first women's tour. And that really like motivated me to keep playing. And now I was able to take home the gold in the second women's tour. And that's about it.
Yeah, it was really exciting. Do you remember how many players there were?
It's somewhere actually, I think it's about like 125 or so. It was just barely like we almost had like the 8 Swiss rounds. It's just not enough. Just a little bit under 128. That's not
Yeah,
getting
it,
there, but
it was a. This is the like second major tournament of Series 8, so this is really like defining the metagame, and you came out with a team that no one had really ever seen before, and obviously won the entire tournament, did really well with it. And so, do you want to talk a little bit about the team that you used?
right. Um, so the team actually has a kind of like semi-funny origin story. So I frequently build teams with like Gavin Michaels, and we often like kind of play a lot together. And at one point on the ladder, he had randomly seen like an Umbreon, and I was like, "Oh my god, I want to build an Umbreon team," just kind of for fun. Because personally, I enjoy building teams kind of around one sort of like weird niche pick. So in Series 7, that was like kind of Azumarill. Like I did whatever I could to kind of just shoehorn it onto every single team I was using. And at the time, it was Series 7, so I was like, well, let's find a way to kind of like have a good Umbreon team and like something that can take advantage of yawn forcing switches. And kind of what I came up with, as well as Gavin, was sort of like a Dragon Dance like Gyarados sweeper team because Gyarados matched up really, really well into kind of like the top 3 threats at the time, which were like Tapu Fini, Incin, Rillaboom. Like Gyarados does very well against all of those. And that was how the team kind of had its super early origins, sort of like in Series 7. So you can kind of see like at the bottom, like several Series 7 teams featuring like an Umbreon, a Clefairy, changed to a Salamence at one point, so on and so forth. And then it was announced that Series 8 would have like the one restricted format. So I was like, well, crap, like all this building I've been doing is kind of like going out the window. Like, how will Umbreon function when Zacian is basically everywhere? But as it turns out, Umbreon is actually not that bad in restricted formats due to foul play being not only stab, but also nearly every restricted has some kind of like sky high attack stat, even if it's a special attacker. So Umbreon can always be kind of like putting out pressure on the field with either yawn or foul play, because even like a resisted foul play will like chunk a restricted at any given time. And I was also partially inspired because there was a Liberty Note report that came out very, very early on, kind of into Series 8, or like when it was first announced, that had like an Umbreon Clefairy team. And I was like, well, great, this is what I've already been using. So let's figure out a way to kind of like make our setup sweeper plus Umbreon Clefairy kind of work. And it actually began with like a weird Tornogre variant where I like tried to tack on a Calm Mind Kyogre because it seemed really good in theory, but not in practice because Kyogre loves Water Spout. So it's kind of like, well, let's figure out something better that we can do with this, especially given that like Rain doesn't synergize well with Umbreon's one recovery move, which is Moonlight, but Sun does. So let's just make a Sun team. And as you can see, it kind of went through several iterations, including like a weird Zacian variant that didn't want it. The Rain team eventually had like a Raichu on it, and then we have our Sun Umbreon team, which I kind of just slapped together like randomly in like 5 minutes. And it was okay. The stack was like a little weird at times, and I felt that the Venusaur wasn't putting out quite as much like damage as I wanted it to. Like I really needed it to get stuff done because like the team has like an Umbreon on it. Like it's a little passive. And then eventually I sort of just switched to Charizard just because Charizard has such like crazy damage output. And that is a team that we have up top, which is the team that I ended up taking to the women's tour and winning.
And the team obviously performed really well for you. When do you think that you? How many days before the tour did you finalize this team?
About a week, actually, maybe like a little less than a week. The team was pretty stable overall, except for like the sixth slot. It was like a bunch of different things to sort of like help out with the rain matchup. And then eventually I settled on a Cortana just because it's like, it's decent enough into Kyogre, and that's just what we needed to do.
Yeah, and so this tournament happened about 2 weeks into the format, and so we had one major that happened about a week ago, and that tournament we saw no Groudon in top cut. We saw a lot of Zacian and Lapras teams and a lot of Kyogre teams, and of course you really needed to account for both of those. But Zacian doesn't fare too well doesn't really want to take those ground moves or those fire moves that your team is going to be firing off, and so Groudon really seemed like a really strong pick. Can you tell me a little bit about the Pokemon on your team and what they do?
Right. So I would say it's kind of like pretty standardish, maybe some, with like some few kind of weirder picks in there. So I spent the entirety of Series 7, I swear to God this is related, playing P2 Grimmsnarl, and I just really wanted kind of like another super grindy team that's kind of like it seems like it's not doing anything, but then later it does. So obviously Umbreon is kind of like a great representation of that, as is Erie Impulse P2. Love that thing. I've been using it since Players Cup 2, and P2 is still like a really awesome trick room setter, given the prevalence of Calyrex Shadow in this format. So he had to be there as well. Groudon and Charizard are pretty self-explanatory, like kind of like, a really good, strong, like weather duo. I really liked Swords Dance Groudon, as I felt like, there's a lot of opportunities to just kind of raw Swords Dance with like the yawning, the trick rooming, the pressure that Charizard puts on the field as well. And I just felt like it was a great fit. And then the Indeedee was kind of on there, kind of like for redirection, sort of in case of more kind of like hyper offensy teams, where it's like this team has a lot of bulk, but it can't always, like take really, really strong hits. Which you can kind of like see in my top 4 match versus Lauren. Like her team was doing so much damage with that heat wave. So Indeedee was kind of there to like kind of redirect sort of strong like single target moves, as well as to guarantee Trick Room in scenarios where Trick Room was like strong. And then the Cortana was kind of on there like last minute, as I said earlier. So one question I've gotten from people on Twitter is why Guillotine on the Cortana? And the answer to that is primarily because it's really funny and I love clicking Guillotine. But the kind of more, I guess, nuanced answer is that Guillotine as Max Strike and Max Airstream off of Aerial Ace essentially accomplish the same thing in getting either like a speed boost or a speed drop. Additionally, a lot of things are running like random Koba berries because of like random Max Airstreams, and you can get like a little more damage off with that immediate Max Strike. As well as it does have a slightly higher like max move base power. I think it's something like 130 to like 110 for max airstream. And also a lot of people will kind of like intimidate spam or try to like burn your Cortana so that like the pressure of beast boost is kind of just like off the field. But if you have Guillotine, that doesn't matter. So I thought, well, maybe like a potential 30% chance to win the game just by like randomly KOing someone's restricted or someone's switching they thought was safe is like not that bad. It's better than Aerial Ace, and that's why it's there.
And I gotta ask, how many times did you hit Guillotine in the tournament?
I'm really sad. I clicked Guillotine once because I only brought Cortana to one set, but it was very, very funny on ladder.
Mm-hmm. And I think Gavin showed me a replay of one of you hitting a Guillotine into a Solgaleo and just immediately winning the game and someone being really salty. So it gives you that 30% chance to immediately win the game. And one thing that I think is really cool about this team is it really forces your opponent to play passively, because Umbreon punishes aggressive play so heavily with Snarl and with Yawn. If your opponent Dynamaxes into it and just takes a couple special attack drops, they kind of wasted their Dynamax. And similarly, if you Yawn into their Dynamax, they just, they're forced to switch out or only get 1.5 turns out of their Dynamax. That's also not very good. And so you have so many different things to take advantage of the fact that the game's going to be slower with things like Swords Dance Groudon, or Groudon in general just loves firing Precipice Blades off, not when it needs to hit a Precipice Blades, but when it just can do damage because it's not being threatened. Charizard's Wildfire does so much when the game is slowed down and your opponent can't KO you in 3 turns. And this is in pretty stark contrast to a lot of the other Sun teams we've seen, where they've really doubled down on the aggressive play with like a Thundurus to deter Intimidate. I think that's the version that you faced in top 4 of this tournament, and then also the version that Edu used to win the RPGC ladder tournament this past weekend. But I really like this version more because of the way that it slows down the game against these other aggressive teams and does something that no other team in this format so far has really managed to accomplish. And so with that in mind, can you tell me a little bit about the common game plans of the team?
Right. So the most common game plan I use is something just called like, I colloquially refer it to as like bringing the girls, which is basically just leading P2, Umbreon, Groudon, Charizard, and back. And the purpose of this is to kind of like what a lot of people will do when they like see Sun in team preview, and I know because I'm guilty of this, is like lead their kind of like designated like answer to Sun. Like everyone looks at this team in preview and thinks you're bringing Groudon, Charizard. But when you bring Umbreon and P2 instead, it kind of forces them to put out their like resources to deal with Sun very early on into the game. And you can kind of like take advantage of that and start like shutting down those resources with like Yawn, Snarl, Eerie Impulse, like Trick Rooming, you know, whatever is most convenient at the time. And what I also especially love kind of about this more passive lead is that it's like, it's at any moment the Sun could come out. And it's just kind of like, in a way, you're sort of like messing around with your opponent a little bit by like kind of like creating these scenarios where like gradually their mons are kind of like worn down by a combination of like Ice Beam and Foul Play, either that or they're all put to sleep. And then the Sun Bat can come in and just clean up really easily. So that was what I liked the most. I would say kind of like the only sort of like different leads I had were occasionally into other like kind of like hyper offense Sun type teams, I would lead either Groudon and DD or Charizard and DD just to like get a KO right away with like Helping Hand plus like a strong like single target move. And that works really effectively because it's like a max Charizard can KO a lot of things that you think it like shouldn't be able to KO while it's in the sun, such as like max Groudon and other max Charizard with a Helping Hand boost. So I found that really convenient as well. And DD in general sort of like came on the field when it's like I felt that there was a need to like have redirections to say like there's a Venusaur that's like sleep powdering or an Amoonguss that's sporing. And then against Rain, I would almost always lead like Groudon, Kartana and kind of like pick your favorites in back. The Rain matchup obviously is like a little tough with this team. It's a lot of kind of just like guessing switches and like constantly like switching out your own Groudon and making sure that you have the Sun out. So it's a little bit grindy, but it's nothing too bad. And those were generally my most common like game plans with this team.
And in the Rain matchup, what Pokemon did you drop from the girls to bring Kartana?
The girls. Generally, I would drop Charizard, actually. I never bring Charizard into Sun. It's just not worth it. It's like a little too like squishy in case something goes horribly wrong and it's like not the fastest thing on the field. Normally, I would just bring like Groudon, Kartana, and kind of like either Umbreon and DD or P2. Usually P2 Umbreon, sometimes in DD. It kind of varies depending on what like specific text the Rain user has kind of added to their team. But generally kind of like a sort of like Groudon-centric like game plan or like a Kartana-centric game plan worked well versus those teams. It's just a matter of like giving them the support they needed to like take those kills.
Yeah, it feels like in this format, a lot of matchups are decided based on how you're restricted to match up into each other. And so Groudon does really well into Zacian and Dialga and stuff like that. And Umbreon does a really good job of dealing with a lot of the other restricteds. And so you managed to find a way to make the Kyogre matchup, which is probably the one thing that Groudon's a little weak to, a little more bearable. Although it sounds like you didn't actually face that many Kyogre in your run. Can you tell me a little bit about the tournament itself and maybe a memorable game that you played?
Yeah, for sure. So you're right in that I very luckily managed to like not roll any Kyogres day one. I thought that people just weren't bringing Kyogre into this tournament because what I sort of enjoy about the women's tour, and one of the things I think it makes like it kind of unique, is that you tend to see kind of like a lot of like weird like off meta teams, particularly with this tour. Even very early on into the format, like people bring some really, really weird like stuff to this tour. So it's always interesting to see what they have. And I thought, well, because everyone's using Tornogre, maybe no one in this tour is using it, but I was wrong. Like there's a lot of Tornogre in Top Cut. I just didn't play it. I would say probably my most like memorable sets were in Top Cut for sure. I was pretty anxious going into Top Cut, thinking like, okay, so I got here again. Like I have to make sure I take it home this time. So I I actually spent the entirety of like the night before Top Cut, like sort of like scouting out like my entire side of the bracket because most of these games were streamed. So I was like really, really sort of over prepared and like very nervous the day of because I was like, well, crap, I did all this scouting. Like, what will happen? Like, if I lose. But funnily enough, my first Top Cut match was versus a Rain team, and it was sort of like an offbeat Rain team that had like a Latias and a Salamence, and I was like very deathly afraid that it was Rain Dance Latias because like that's my worst match. I had sort of projected into thinking that it was on that team, but it went fine with like the Kartana and the Groudon as well to keep kind of like rolling in Sun after I'd like set up Trick Room. So there was that. I would say probably my most interesting match I had in Top Cut was actually versus Midori because on paper I had a not like a very, very bad matchup, but there were some things on Midori's team specifically that are sort of hard for this team to deal with, such as Taunt Incineroar and like Turbo Amoonguss. So I was pretty nervous going into that as well, thinking like, well, Instin's just gonna like taunt like the girls to death, and I like can't get any yawns up or anything. And I sort of like made it out of that one, kind of just Instinct can only taunt one thing at a time, right? And also, if you switch in something else that like doesn't care about being taunted, that Instinct just wasted a turn taunting, and now it like can't do anything else. So kind of with that in mind, I was able to sort of move past that matchup as well. I would say what's interesting sort of about the top 4 set versus Lauren was that I actually already played her once in Swiss and had kind of gotten by leading like Indeedee Charizard. And actually the normal 4 that I bring, which is P2 Umbreon, Groudon, Charizard, but I figured I shouldn't do that again because she actually crit like both of my leads game 2 and I just lost the game off of that. So I thought, well, I guess I'll just lead redirection and like she'll set up the Sun for me and maybe I can get something done with that. And I was able to off of that. It was sort of it was a very kind of like speed tie dependent matchup, but that's just how it is with Sun teams. And I was like, well, if I lose a speed tie, I lose a speed tie. It's not like a big deal. Got back to top 4 again anyway. And then my set versus Mogar, I was honestly pretty excited for it because I didn't kind of put 2 and 2 together at the time. But looking back, like on the matches, like it seems that Mogar was expecting me to bring the Sun lead because I had like led Sun in to Lauren like all 3 games of the top 4 match, and they were it seemed like they were ready to deal with that with Raichu Landorus. But that's not what I brought, and it was definitely kind of amusing for me, the Umbreon player, to just kind of be like correctly like guessing like switches and like being able to like constantly keep up like yawn pressure, as well as like setting up Trick Room and sort of like having ways for the Groudon, Charizard, and back to terrorize the rest of the Lapdog team. And yeah, those were my Top Cut matches.
Yeah, and those top 4 and finals games were streamed on Victory Road. I'm pretty sure the VODs are still on their Twitch channel. And the finals game especially was just an absolute masterclass. You played that so incredibly well. And so that was a really great showcase of how the team performs. And once again, congratulations on winning this tournament. This was like a really, really impressive performance and really, really unique. And I would say like meta-defining team. I think that this is one of the ways that Sun can evolve in this format. And I really like the way that this Sun team is built in terms of punishing your opponent's aggressive play and allowing Groudon and Charizard to really thrive rather than trying to facilitate a more aggressive mode that I think you described as a little more 50-50 based. So yeah, do you have any final words or shout outs that you want to give?
Right. So shout out to Gavin Michaels, obviously, for like helping me with prep, as well as the team. Shout out to Tub Nation for best of threes. You guys are great. And most of all, shout out to Midnight the Umbreon. Didn't think he'd hard carry this far, but he did. And yeah, it was just pretty great to be able to like actually win a tournament with like a Pokemon that I've had since I was like 8, like for real. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was great having you. And until next time, I will see you all later.